I'm ready to hop in. Here we go. Start with taxes. In three, two. Hello and welcome into New York's Asset Protection Roundtable, a three pillars of protection program. I am Ben George. He's Ted Alatsis, attorney and counselor at law at Alatsis Law Firm in Brooklyn, New York. Ted, welcome in. How's everything going today?
Oh, it's doing great, Ben. How are you? Hope all is well.
I am. Everything has been going well. Been able to enjoy some trips out of town last month or so before that cooler weather moves in, and we have to settle in a little bit and kind of hunker down. But I hope you've been able to do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fall weather has just started to hit us here in New York a little bit. So nice little cool day today. So it's fall is here for sure.
Yes, it is indeed. And we got a good show for you today here on the podcast. We're talking about taxes. Nobody wants to talk about taxes. I know it's the topic that may turn a lot of people off, but it's so important when you talk about estate planning to consider the tax consequences that occur with everything that you leave behind. And there's a lot of different categories with taxes that we have to go through today and kind of break it down. But I know, Ted, this is not something that probably people think about very often, and B, don't want to talk about very much, right?
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, Ben Franklin once said, "There's only two things in life that are certain: death and taxes." Right. So, this podcast kind of deals with both of those issues. So here we are. Yeah, absolutely. No one wants to talk about death and dying and planning for their death, but no one also wants to talk about their taxes either. So,
Yeah.
yeah, fitting topic today.
Well, I know people also talk quite a bit, in this category with their CPA or their financial advisor, but how do you fit into that tax planning conversation, Ted, when you're working with people with their estate?
So, when we're talking to people about their estates, we do talk about the tax consequences, and one of the big conversations is about, are the beneficiaries going to need to pay taxes on what they inherit? And so, it is important to be familiar with what taxes are available to them, or what taxes they may be liable for. So it's an important part of the conversation in terms of planning for sure.
Very good. So we got three different categories we'll go through, plus a little bonus tax that you maybe haven't thought too much about or doesn't apply to everyone. So we'll throw that one in towards the end. And again, if you have questions, alatzislawfirm.com is the website. You can also call 718-233-2903. All right, let's start off with, I guess, the main one at the core here, the estate tax, the gift tax. This is one that I think people have probably heard of, but what do they need to know about this, Ted?
So the estate tax, or some people like to call it the death tax, right? Is a tax that is assessed against the size of the estate, and depending on how big that estate is, then that's going to determine what the tax amount would be. For federal estate tax purposes, an individual's estate um, in excess of 12.06 million is taxable at about 40% of what the excess amount would be. That doesn't apply to a lot of people, and so a lot of people don't have to worry about it so much at present. But in 2026, that's scheduled to go back to about half of that exclusion. And so, if you're at that $6 million level, and that's not really an unheard of amount to think about, especially if you live in New York, then it's important to start at least thinking about how you're going to deal with your estate with that. In New York State, New York also has a death tax, and that's taxable for estates in excess of 6 million, just over 6 million. And again, they're subject to the same period of return to a lower number in 2026. And the estate tax there is a little lower, but again, it's a lower threshold.
So with this estate tax, this gets paid out before things get distributed, right?
Right. It's assessed against the entirety of the estate. Now there are some exemptions, which there's creative planning can take advantage of, and basically you can give you know anything you want to your spouse, right? So you can certainly plan by using those types of credits. So that's one thing. One thing you can do in terms of planning. But yeah, it's taxed against the entirety of the estate.
And federal and state, for most people, get cuts, right? I mean, I know you're working with mainly with people in New York, but I know people listening to the podcast from outside of New York. There is that two layer, right? The federal and state in many cases.
Correct. And there are states that where that actually varies, right? So there are states where there's the estate tax kicks in at $1, right? So it varies from state to state. So that the state rules, you'd have to just look at your own state and see what those rules would be.
All right. Second category here, one you touched on a little bit already, the inheritance tax. Now, this one's obviously a little bit different than the estate tax, but this is one that impacts a lot of people, right? And one that I think people pay quite a bit of attention to when they're deciding how to leave money to their beneficiaries.
Right now, an inheritance tax would really be something that's more on a state level because there really isn't a specific federal inheritance tax. But that would be, inheritance. If someone inherits something, then that individual who's receiving the inheritance would have to pay a tax on what they've received. So there is no federal inheritance tax, and there's very, very few states that have an inheritance tax. New York does not, for example.
Well, that's a nice benefit then
Mm-hmm.
for New Yorkers not having that. Okay. Something to think about if you're outside of the state of New York and listening. Do you want to check on the inheritance tax? All right. Income tax. We know we're very well aware of income tax. All of us are hit with that every single day. But how does it apply here to estate planning?
So one of the most oftenly asked question that I receive with regards to taxes is, am I going to have to pay income tax on the stuff that I've inherited? The short answer is no. For the most part, inheritance is not considered income for estate tax for income tax purposes, and so it's not taxable. Now there are some limited circumstances. For example, if you're receiving an IRA or some other retirement account, the withdrawals of those funds could be taxable. So there would be income tax based on that, the same way withdrawing your own IRA would be subject to income tax. So it does. So that would be one of those circumstances where you would have to pay income tax. Let's say you've inherited an income producing property, real estate, or something like that. The the asset itself may not be taxable, but the income that asset generates would be taxable as income. So it really depends on the type of assets that you're receiving and whether that asset is producing income independent of the inheritance.
Does this income tax play a big part in the planning that you do? It seems like the estate tax might be a little bit more, or inheritance tax where it applies might be a little bit more. But does income tax factor into a lot of the decisions you're making?
It does, certainly. I mean, it really factors in when you're discussing things like income producing assets, right? So when you have assets that are going to generate high levels of income, then that could factor into the analysis, certainly. All of these taxes, certainly play a role in planning, and knowing these exclusions that may apply, you know is important, right? One of the great examples, and I love using this example, is the estate tax or death tax. That's been a moving target for a long time. It's a political football.
Hmm.
It's because people who have high value estates, um, they're targets certainly for taxation, and in order to fill budget holes, there's always been a push to kind of reduce that estate tax exclusion as much as possible. In 2010, the budget act that had been passed in 2001 had a loophole, and there was zero estate tax.
Hmm.
So there was no threshold at all at any level where an estate would be taxable. And George Steinbrenner, who was the owner of the Yankees, had died in 2010. And if he had died in any other year, his family would probably had to have sold the Yankees to pay the estate tax, because the Yankees were worth about $2 billion. So they would have probably, in order to come up with about $1 billion in taxes, they would have had to sell the Yankees. But because George Steinbrenner died in 2010, they didn't have to pay anything in estate taxes, and so the Steinbrenner family continues to own the Yankees to this day.
Hmm.
So planning, and knowing what your exclusions are is an important part of any kind of planning that you're going to do um, with the estate plan, for sure.
That's an incredible story. As a sports fan, I had not heard that, did not realize that was the case, and it's pretty remarkable. And I know we're never, 99.999% of us won't ever be in the situation where we're passing on a $2 billion asset to a family member. But in your case, if you were planning for the Steinbrenners, are you able to come up with a plan that can allow that asset to stay within the family? I mean, that's kind of a bigger look at it, and it can obviously apply to smaller cases. But are there ways around that when the taxes are going to be so large?
Yeah, so there are certain things that you can plan for, and there are ways that you can fund estate taxes in your plans, whether it's with insurance policies that will be designed to cover some of that estate tax, or whether it's structuring an asset so that it generates revenue so that it doesn't need to be liquidated in order to pay estate taxes. So there are things that there are vehicles that can be implemented. Look, for most people, they're not going to have an estate that's over $12 million, or they're not going to have an estate that's over $6 million. So it's less of a concern. But if they go back to the lower amounts and they reduce those by half, not unheard of. It's not unheard of to be a New Yorker and own a home and have some IRAs and have some other assets and be over that $3 million threshold. That would not be out of the realm of possibility for a lot of people. So planning is important, and knowing how to use all the exclusions that are available, certainly it would benefit a person who's planning their estate.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. All right, we got one bonus category here for us: capital gains taxes. And I think currently I'm kind of familiar with this. We currently get the step up in basis, right? So I don't know that I think I've heard that that could be going away at some point, maybe pretty soon. Maybe that's already been decided on. I'm not sure, but how does this apply to planning here?
So the step up is a tremendous benefit, and that really goes to the question of capital gain. So right now, the step up still exists, and what essentially that means is that if a person dies and has an asset, the easiest one to use is real property. Okay, if they own a home that they purchased, say, 30 years ago for 70 or $80,000, and now it's worth $1 million. On their death, their estate provides that it goes to their children. The children now inherit that at the value of $1 million. That's what the step up is. They get a step up in basis, and the reason why that's important is because the basis is what's used to determine what capital gains tax would be paid. Capital gains tax is a tax that's assessed on essentially the profit. The profit is determined to be the value of your sale minus the value of your cost basis, your basis. So in the scenario we just described, family just inherited it at $1 million. If they go to sell the house now and they sell it for $1 million, there's no tax that's due. If they were to wait a year and sell it for $1.2 million, then that 200,000 would be taxable as capital gains. And a capital gains rate in New York City, depending on where your income tax bracket is, about 35% of your profit. Okay. If you don't have the step up, okay, and they inherit the property at the cost basis of their parents, and they get it at $70,000, and now they've inherited it's worth $1 million, and they sell it, and they have to pay capital gains on that million minus 70, or 930,000. That's $350,000 in tax approximately. So you see, just from that example, how important that step up is. So right now there's talk about trying to get rid of that step up, and that certainly is going to hurt planning in the future, or certainly affect a lot of planning in the future. And so it's important to kind of consider that as a tool at the moment, for planning purposes.
Yeah, well, the bottom line, planning is so important, and you got to be factoring in taxes. And we know the government will always find a way to get their piece of the pie. So you want to always try to do your best to protect what you've been able to accumulate and earn and grow over your lifetime, and that you want to pass on to whatever beneficiary that might be, whether it's family, friends, or a charity of some sort. But you always want as much of your money to go there as possible. So again, estate planning is so very important. So again, if you want to get in touch with Ted, set up a time to meet with him, alatzislawfirm.com. That is the website, and the phone number 718-233-2903. Ted, as always, good to catch up with you. Thanks for taking us through this taxes conversation, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you, Ben. Great talking with you, and I look forward to it again.